So the preacher that says we're going to be silent doesn't silence his phone. How's that for you? All right. So today we're going to look at our first root rot. And what I mean by that is we're going to spend the morning looking at Jacob as someone who, like I said, runs from God. But we're going to look at some of the deeper things in our lives that could cause us to not grow properly or cause us to not bear the fruit that we should be bearing. And so the first one is the shadow self. And we're going to take this from Genesis 25:19 through 28. It says this: These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel of Aramean of Padan, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah his wife conceived. And the children struggled within her, and she said, If it is thus, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The younger one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. And when her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all of his body like a hairy cloak, so they called his name Esau. And afterward his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. And while the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. One of my favorite church fathers has a saying. In one of his messages he preached, he said, whatever is not consciously embraced cannot be transformed. So what he was trying to get us to see in that sermon is that unless we awaken to this divine reality of who we really are and to what we are really called, we cannot engage the Spirit to do what we're called to do, to be who we are. Yes, we are saved and everything is wonderful and awesome, but we're not just supposed to go through life. We're supposed to grow into Christ-likeness. And so to embrace that calling, to embrace that, we have to look honestly and see the things in our lives that are not good, to see the things that are good, to press into the things that are good, but lay down and lay aside the things that are bad. So the question is what is your shadow? Those things that we've not consciously embraced, that's what we're going to call our shadow today. And your shadow is the stockpile of untamed emotions, less than pure motives and thoughts that strongly influence and shape your behaviors. It's the mostly hidden part. Sometimes it's damaged. Sometimes it's just personality quirks that we have that we just need to deal with before the Lord. But that shadow erupts in various forms. Sometimes it is sinful things like perfectionism or outbursts of anger, jealousy, resentment, lust, greed. Sometimes it's more subtle, like a need to rescue others or to be liked by people, a need to be noticed, and an ability to stop working, a tendency towards isolation. Aspects of the shadow may be sinful, but they also may be just weaknesses or wounds. They tend to appear as we try to protect ourselves from feeling vulnerable or exposed. This means that the shadow is not simply another word of sin. And I've already talked about this thought, but I want you to really focus on it right now. Our tree up here, the one that you have also on your sheet, half the life is above and half the life is below. In our most honest moments, some of us will admit that we know that life that's below is not where it should be. We want to be Christians in the sense that we want the leaves and the fruit to be there. We want to be growing in our Christ likeness. We want other people to know that we're Christians. We want to say the right things, do the right things, act the right way. But because the roots haven't been properly tended to, we can clean up our lives. We can go to church. We can do the things that we're supposed to do. But that inner life is still rotten. And occasionally, it shows itself, and we become like Frank. And the other thing about it is sometimes we will let down that and think, well, I gave up this, drugs, alcohol. I quit doing that. But we sure really didn't deal with the root behavior. And the problem is that contemporary spiritual formation and discipleship addresses some of these ideas. But the problem is that the larger part of our lives remains untouched. And there's no serious engagement with what we're going to call today this root rot. The shadow self, our root rot, revolves around three basic temptations. They're the same temptations you face. They're the same temptations I face. They're the same temptations Christ faced on a daily basis. They're the same temptations all of humanity faces, right? We know what they are. They're the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, the pride of life. Now, as a theologian, as a spiritual counselor, as a teacher of the faith, as just a Christian, I understand the issue is not that we can name the temptations. Some of us can even tell you that that's from 1 John, right? The issue is that we've not taken the time or made the effort to see if we have any of that down inside of us. If I'm struggling with a desire of the flesh, if I'm struggling with the desire of my eyes, if I'm struggling with the pride of life. So I want to give us some examples, and I don't want them to be the only thing you think of. They're going to be very broad so that they can just stimulate your thinking and your self-examination. Some of us have gifts in speaking and mobilizing people, and that's good. But the shadow side of that gift is a constant need for affirmation. Even public sharing of repentance and failure can be motivated by the need for approval. And it's not uncommon for those of us with gifts of speaking to use them to distance ourselves from close relationships. Maybe you value excellence. That's great. That's awesome. I need those kind of people in my life because I don't. But the shadow side emerges when the pursuit of excellence crosses into perfectionism and makes no allowances for mistakes. Our perfectionism silences our inner voices of either failure or shame or regret. Maybe we're zealous for God's truth and right doctrine. That's good. But the shadow, the root rot, emerges when our zeal prevents us from loving those whom we disagree with. Many people that are so zealous for God's truth that they want to silence everyone else as they're driven by their own insecurities and fears about feeling competent or being right. We want to see the church maximize its potential for Christ, and that's good. However, the shadow takes over when we become so preoccupied with achieving the objectives that we've set that we're unwilling to listen to others, or we create an unsustainable pace for those serving with us. Again, we have a desire and a need for constant praise or to show others that we are working, or perhaps even working more than they are. Perhaps you're a person that likes to serve. That's great. That's good. But the shadow reveals itself as when we hide ourselves in the kitchen at social events, or because we've cooked and done the dishes and all the things at family events. Maybe we don't want to engage and talk to other people in the family or at church. It's our way of protecting ourselves from getting close, from getting hurt, from having real relationship where there's the opportunity for disappointment and failure. Perhaps you've accepted a new assignment in a city, whether it be in the ministry or a different job in general. You've had to move because of family or something. There's nothing wrong with that. That's good. But the shadow emerges that before we leave, we pick a fight or we ignore others at our current assignment because the idea of goodbye is too hard for us to bear. It's easier to ignore them or cause a fight or to get them in trouble with our boss as we're leaving than just to simply acknowledge, I'm going to miss you. As all that wasn't bad enough, the desires of the eyes, the pride of life, those kind of things wasn't bad enough. The way those things manifest in our lives sometimes become so much a part of us and such a part of our family that we just assume that it's always been that way, so it's always going to be that way. Another one of my favorite authors says that Jesus is in our hearts, but Grandpa is in our bones. And I told you that we're going to be looking at Jacob, and we're going to start that right now, that Jacob did some things that were wrong, just flat out immoral. But my premise, at least at the beginning, is Jacob was only seeing what he saw his parents and his grandparents do. Jacob's family was rotten, so he turned out rotten as well. And I think that the big issue with Jacob is, and this is Jason reading into the story, all right, is that Jacob wasn't self-aware enough to identify some of these patterns in his family and say, I've got to stop doing this until it had caused problems in his children. So we had this 4-generation thing going on, and it wasn't until that 4th generation that one of them said, whoa, this is messed up. And today we're going to define a family as an emotional system of 2 to 4 generations who move through life together in different places at different times. When we are born into families, we inherit their ways of relating, their values, and their ways of living in the world. Adopted children, they really got it messed up because they not only have their blood family, but also the family that they're adopted into. Your family story and your individual story cannot be separated. For example, there was a pattern of lying in each generation. Now, I know that we say that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the patriarchs, that we kind of hold them to an esteem, and that's great, and that's wonderful. God did give them a promise. God did set them apart. He called them away from every other nation in the world. God did all those things, and they should be honored and revered for that. But I want us to also look honestly at some of the things that they did. So in each generation, there was a pattern of lying. We know that Abraham lied twice, at least, about Sarah being his sister and not his wife. Isaac and Rebekah's marriage was characterized by lies. We're going to look at a couple of those before the day's over. Jacob lied to almost everyone. In fact, his very name means deceiver. And then 10 of Jacob's children lied about Joseph's death, faked a funeral, and kept a family secret for over 10 years. There was favoritism in each generation by at least one parent. Abraham favored Ishmael. Isaac favored Esau. Rebekah favored Jacob. Jacob didn't learn the lesson, and he favored Joseph, and then later favored Benjamin, right? Brothers were separated in each generation. Isaac and Ishmael, Abraham's sons, were cut off from one another. Jacob fled his brother Esau, was completely cut off for years. Joseph was cut off from his 10 brothers, 11 if we count Benjamin, for over a decade. There was poor intimacy in the marriages of each generation. Abraham had the child with Hagar. Isaac had a terrible relationship with Rebekah. And Jacob had 2 wives and 2 concubines. Now look at that list. When you look at the patriarchs like that, you're like, how did anything ever good happen in their lives? It's a messed up mess. And I would suggest that our lives perhaps aren't much different. That God is working in our lives, and it is the wonderful grace and mercy of God that anything good happens in our lives at all. And it is a great truth that God fulfills His promise. I'm going to call you out, and your children are going to be like the sand of the seas, what He told Abraham, right? If you will follow me, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. But at the same time, the promise of God, as wonderful and awesome as that is completely in the hands of God. God working out His promise, that's His territory. This stuff here, though, I follow God. But if we look at Abraham lying about Sarah, Isaac and Jacob lying to each other, Jacob lying to everybody, we go, how are they following God if they're lying all the time? The favoritism towards the children, I must admit that having favorite children and grandchildren, it's easy to do, but that doesn't excuse the fact that it's the right thing to do. Brothers being separated, as someone who doesn't have close relationship with my biological family, again, it's easy, but that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And this idea of not examining ourselves and looking deep inside of ourselves and saying, what is my responsibility? And perhaps for what me and Deborah have lived by is how can we break this cycle and not continue to let it live on in our children and our grandchildren. And for us, the idea of our great-grandchildren. How are we living life differently so that it stops with us? They never had that kind of thought. They just repeated the same old mistakes. I've heard so many people say, well, my grandpa was a drinker. My dad was a drinker. I can't help but be a drinker. I think that was kind of the attitude that we see on display here. It may not be voiced like that, but their actions say that. So this idea of our physical, biological family influences us. We get that. Then I would suggest that perhaps our spiritual family influences our well. Sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly. The churches that we're part of influence the way we see love, kindness, goodness, and how those play out in the lives and the world around us. Sometimes the churches and the denominations we're part of don't teach us forbearance or generosity or kindness. Dealing with this root rot, the shadow part of us, demands that we put off the sinful patterns of our family of origin and relearn what it means to be human. And I use that phrase on purpose, relearning what it means to be human. The glory and the plan of God is for each of one of us to be fully alive. And later we're going to look at the idea that God wants each one of us to eat at the tree of life. That was his plan at the very beginning. That's his plan today. And that's definitely his plan for the future. But eating of the tree of life is not something that is just future or something that was just past. 2 Peter tells us that we get to be partakers of the divine nature now. Paul tells us over and over again to put on Christ. Jesus himself said that the Spirit is going to dwell within us, and out of our bodies would flow rivers of living water. Have you partaken of the divine nature? Well, I got saved. Well, okay, so all that means in the context of what we're talking today is that a seed got planted in the ground and a sapling came up. You're saved. Now what? The Spirit of God has come along and tried to fertilize and help it grow. The church, the people in your life that are loving you and praying for you are trying to help you grow. The difference between us and trees is that we get to refuse to grow, where a tree just continues to grow with all the fertilizer and the sun and the rain. Have you put on Christ? I would suggest that if you still are struggling with any of the things already that we've talked about this morning, maybe you put him on when it's convenient and then you take him back off. So let us acknowledge our shadows. Let us deal with our shadows. Let us relearn what it means to be human. I would suggest that we really don't know what it means to be human until we get saved. And then we grow into the humanity that God designed us to be as we go through life. And that as we grow, we got to be careful that we don't get comfortable with where we're at. Again, the pruning, the shaping. If God's the one that's calling the shots here, He's going to prune here, He's going to shape here, He's going to say that I need more fruit or I need less fruit. He gets to determine all of those things. But He can't do that if the roots aren't where they should be. Let's embrace the fullness of the new birth in all of its glory and receive it in all of its glory and power so that we can know His glory and power, so that others can know His glory and power. Before the day's over, we're going to be thinking about this root rot as one of the things that keeps people from coming to Christ. It's not sermons that bring people to Christ. Now, you hear what I'm saying? I understand. I got preachers in the room. I understand that you preach, people come forward to get saved. But it's not that sermon that got them in the back door. It was someone inviting them. And people that invite, that have root rot in their lives, people go, if that's what it means to be a Christian, I can do that without going to church. Why go to church? We've got to give them something different. And until we deal with the root rot that's in our lives, we're not giving them anything different. We're just giving them what they already know. So, let's go with our first 5 minutes of silence. Our second, and go through your questions.